Good morning. We're on page 138 in Tzaddik Dalet, Tofresh Tzaddik Dalet. The text that we are studying is all available at ayinbeis.com. So this corresponds with pages 1157 and 1158 in Ayin Beis, volume 2. And we're talking about the second oifen, second manner, the second level or the second method of Bittul. Checking the pages here, 1157, 1158 on top, which is what he calls Ein Zuloscha, that here it's not just that the Oir senses that it's nullified in the presence of something greater, but here the Oir itself, it says Mitziyus Atzmei, the Bittul is in the Metzias Atzmei of the Oir. And what does that mean? He says that being that the Oir is, two things are necessary for the Oir is, because being that the Oir is connected to the Moir, to the source, so that connection makes that the Oir would not exist were it not for its source. So therefore its entire existence is not its own. It's completely dependent, completely. And the source, if there was no source, there'd be no Oir. Then he breaks it into two components. That for there to be Oir, you need two things. That the source should stand in a state of his galus. Like he said, faran, the words he used here in Yiddish, was esis faran begili, that he's present in a state of revelation, and not the Hemshech of the Moir, not that the Moir actually transmits, but that the Moir stands in a state of revelation. And the second thing is the dveikus, the attachment, the connection of the Oir and the Moir. And then after the mashal with the son, he went back and said the same thing is with Oir. That there's Hasgalus HaMoker, he says, is Ein Avon Bizgalus Zu in Hamshacha, but it stands in a state of Gili. Bottom line, Atzmus has chosen to be in a state that he's going to reveal something of himself. And the second, or better put, he's going to recreate the state of awareness and Gili, like we spoke about. And when we say that Dveikus Ha'er Ba'amar, what's the second component? Hakavona Hergish Mekere. So the Moker stands in a state of revelation, and the second, the Oir, is connected and feels the source. And since it feels that its entire existence only due to the source, that's this bittul that we're talking about. I'm reading on page 138. I'll just read one line that we read yesterday and continue from there. So the line begins, Rak mitzad mekere. It's like 10 lines from the top. And he says, only due to the source. And without the source, it's not at all going to an existence. This is a bittul of the Oir, that it's not a self-contained existence, an existence on its own. Rather, its entire existence is only due to its source. But he's also added the component that the source has to stand in a state of Gili for this to be activated. Okay. Now he's going to explain this further by saying, okay, now this is the difference between Oir and Yesh, to really drive the point home, to see the glaring contrast of what Oir really is about. Compare it now to what's the antithesis of Oir. The antithesis of Oir is Yesh. So that's what he's going to explain now, how a Yesh is the exact opposite, diametric opposite. Yesh, its whole existence is that it should not feel its source, and it should not be attached to its source on its own, meaning the way it's created. That's what he's going to say now. V'zehu shezeu ha'hefresh. This is now, and this is the difference. Shezeu, this and shezeu. And this is the difference between Mitzias Hagashmi and Mitzias Ruchni, between a physical existent entity and a spiritual entity. Kamoy ha'oir, like oir. So you see from here that Oir, even though the first manifestation of ruchni, so to speak, the idea of a spiritual energy, of a spiritual expression or a spiritual consciousness is Oyer. But from this extends everything that goes into the world of the ethereal and the spiritual. So when we speak about spirituality, after the Tzimtzum, all the way down, even in this world, Ruchni, Ametzias Ruchni. If you remember, at length he discussed this back when he spoke about the difference between a physical entity and a spiritual entity, where he was saying both of them come from a source, because they're both created. The difference is that the Ruchni, Mitziyuse is not Mitzad Atzmei, but it's Kiyume Mitzad Atzmei. Remember, we spoke about this for long, elaborated, with the Rebbe's long footnote. I'm going back now to, just to give you the sense of where we were. Page, the 30s. Page 31 is the Rebbe's footnote, but it starts earlier. So he said there that a Metzias Ruchni, its existence, just like a Gashmi, its existence is not on its own, like it's from the source. The difference is that Kiyume is Mitzad Atzmei. Why? Because its inherent value, the fact that it's bottled to its source, that, to its credit, has something perpetual, something eternal about it. That's why it's Kiyum Mitzad Atzmei, because its very existence is telling you I have a source. So in Ayin Beis, even though he referred to these differences, it wasn't so elaborate. So the Frierdiker Rebbe is broadening the point that Oyer, Metzias Ruchni, is this type of entity that though it was created, and as we learned, it's Shaloi Be'erech Ta'atzmus. From the point of view of Atzmus, the Yesh and Oyer are equal. But from the point of view of Oyer, it's meaning its type of existence and the way it emerges, we said is not B'derech Lichuk because it's a Gili. And what is it a Gili? Not of itself. It's pointing to the source. So it's like it has a certain emes to it. Gashmi has no emes on its own. Its whole emes is because God created it. That's all. Oyer has a certain emes of its own. When I say its own, because it's not its own. Its very existence is saying, I'm not in existence on my own. That's true. So in a sense, it's like almost like a paradoxical irony that if you declare that I am not existence of my own, I am bottled to my source, that alone gives you a certain emes, because you're basically drawing and channeling the emes of the source into you. That's what Bittul does. The expression that I've explained, Bittul cannot become bottle, because its very definition is Bittul. I'm just pointing it out because it all connected here. There, the point was to make it clear that Atzmus is the only true reality. Now he's talking more about what Oyer is about. So Oyer is essentially a taste of godliness, but it's not Atzmus. So it has a taste of godliness. I say taste. I don't mean taste in a minimal way. I mean it's a ability to experience godliness on our terms, meaning in the Metzias Nimtza, in existence. So he's saying, so therefore, just so Metzias Ruchni, Kamoy HaOyer.
What is Kiyumoy Mitzad Atzmoy?
I'm not going to discuss it now because goes back to page 31. Just go back to the recordings, discussed it at length then. My point was not to go back there, it's just connecting that to here. It's really it's an entire discussion of its own. So and I probably spoke about it for 3 or 4 hours. So you have plenty to listen to. Yeah. Page 31 with the Rebbe's footnote, with the Machzis HaShekel, the Shkolim and okay. So now he's explaining different. This is between Metzias Ruch and K'mayir and Metzias Gashmi and Metzias Ruch K'mayir. What's the difference? The Metzias HaYesh, the existence of a Yesh, and remember, Yesh means a state that's not bottle. If a Yesh and Ayin are exact opposites, Ayin is a state of Ayin of nothingness, meaning I am nothing of my own, and the different levels of Bittul we're learning what Ayin means. Yesh is the opposite. I exist. I'm here. I'm present. Ayin is a state, I'm not present. All I am is a reflection and a extension of the source, and without the source, I don't exist. So he says like this. So Metzias HaYesh, the Metzias HaYesh, Liyesh dam tzos Metziusei hu b'derech ein arech, being not only that it is ein arech, the Yesh is infinitely distant from the Yesh HaNivra, from the Yesh HaMiti, from the source. When I say source, it means he's not called a source. I'm saying source only from the point of view of our language, that's where we originate from. So we also learned Hamtzah is b'derech ein arech. The way God creates the yesh is with a leap. It's not created in a progressive flow where each step, like a state of Hishtalshlus, by definition, Hishtalshlus means like a chain, shalshelas. Every link in the chain is every link in the chain is connected to the previous link. When it comes to yesh, the way it's created is through a leap, that the yesh appears, and the only thing you could trace is ayin, something that we said like we can't understand, a different substance. So it's hamtzah of the yesh is b'derech ein arech. As a result of that, v'hainu the ein zeh masha yesh ein be'erech ha'atzmus. We're not talking about what the yesh is be'ein arech. That's a given. I mean, a given. We've already addressed. What we're talking about now is kim she'isavasi b'derech ein arech. The actual creative process is an ein arech dikaway. And of course, has ein arech in its existence, but it's not ein arech in its way it's created, because it's created through kiruv, through not richuk, which is gili. Now, there's the Rebbe has a footnote here, and I'll get to the footnote in a moment, but I want to first finish the piece, then we'll go to the footnote. So he says, so we're talking about that its method of creation is from a distance, not like, let's say, a potter who has to touch the clay to shape the clay. This is from a distance that the yesh is removed in its manner of creation, also from this creation. And the end of that. This means that its manner of creation, savuse means really bringing into being, but it's, for all practical purposes, you could say its manner of creation. It's dafke, deliberate and precise and explicitly, in a way that it should not be dveikas b'mekere. Because if that it's not attached to its source. Because if it would be attached to its source, it wouldn't be a yesh. So not only is the existence of the yesh ein arech, like he said, but the most important point here is that the yesh itself is not in the form of dveikas. It doesn't indicate on the source. It doesn't reach its source. It doesn't feel its source. Again, all on its own. We're talking about the way the raw yesh is created. So he says, "V'hainu the evenis verse v'dav shalei b'bchinas dveikim b'keri harihu b'bchinas mitzias ba'atzmei." Here I'll just read the footnote. The Rebbe makes a correction here. He says, "Keniruhu ta hamaitik." It's the second footnote on the page. It says, "V'tzarich liyas bimkeri."
Kol hakavod. He wanted to jive. Jive.
Okay, so he says, "She'elei b'bchinas dveikas bimkeri harihu b'bchinas mitzias ba'atzmei." So of course there's something wrong here. Well, I don't know what's the Rebbe. What's bothering the Rebbe? The Rebbe says, "Kenida tos hamaitik, ta hamaitik v'tzarich li is bimkere l'chein harihu oy bimkere v'harehu." Okay. Basically, the harehu, it doesn't read smoothly. It says, even though you could read it like there's a comma, but the Rebbe make it clear. He says, when it says the evidence of dafke shlei b'chinas dveikas b'mkere, so without the Rebbe's footnote, you'd say comma harihu b'chinas mitzias ba'atzmei. But the flow is not so smooth. So the Rebbe gives two options how to correct it. Either after b'mkere should be a comma, and it should say ulechein harihu, and therefore he is an existence of its own, the yesh, oi b'mkere comma v'harehu. So it's either ulechein harehu. This is the Rebbe's footnote just to make the reading clear. But the Havana is clear that basically that being that the yesh is the manner of its creation is ein arech, so it should be a yesh. Therefore, it was explicitly not created in a way of dveikus. And therefore, harihu, imetzias ba'atzmei. So now you have a yesh, so metzias ba'atzmei. Now, of course, you could ask the question, as I always point out, God can do anything. He could create it be'efen kiruv, and it should still feel, but that would be kol yachol. That would not be something that would make sense. That you feel your source, but you still feel your yesh. Here, there's a logical process, that there's a concealment of the creative energy of the divine. It remains ayin. So, the yesh does not feel, is not dovuk, attached to its source. So therefore, what is consciousness? What kind of consciousness of a yesh? A yesh's consciousness is I exist. I am here. Self-contained. And just to elaborate a bit on that, I've talked about it a number of times, but let's just define it. By us, it's a given because we don't know of the mitzias of Oyer. By us, a child is born, you come out of the mother, a child comes out of its mother's womb. So we can't interview the child and ask, do you feel like a yesh? But we can know this is for sure. The child is no longer attached by the umbilical cord. It's no longer part of the mother's being. So the independent consciousness has been born. You could argue the independent consciousness begins at conception even, or definitely throughout the process of pregnancy. But once the child is born, now, does the child act like an independent conscious? Of course not, because the child is dependent on everything, someone to feed it, to protect it, etc. But when is the birth of independence? As soon as, that's the existence of reality. I exist. Now later, that will take on shape and form of true consciousness, where you start, in child psychology, there's a lot of discussion. At what point does the child see itself not as an extension of its parents or its organic family or its friends? That's another discussion. That's when you become aware of self. In a way, the Chet Tzadas, collectively, on a macrocosmic level, that before they ate from the tree of knowledge, they had no real they had independent consciousness because they could choose, but they were completely divine creatures, meaning they recognized the divine, it was natural to them. It was when they tasted from the tree and they began to have their own identity, in a sense, you could say the birth of consciousness. In truth that wasn't really the Chet Tzadas manifested a separate consciousness from the divine consciousness. But the truth is, it really began with creation itself. Bereshis bara Elokim, the tzimtzum, that does that. But in the context of what we're talking here, in a microcosm, the idea that I am here, and there is no natural inclination to say, I feel an extension of my mother, I feel I'm an extension of my father. I'm not talking about psychological suffocation or where parents impose themselves on us. That's another story. I'm talking about your natural consciousness. And the same with Hashem. You don't feel that, no, I'm just like from a source. I'm just a reflection of a higher reality. We don't feel that way. That doesn't mean you can't come to feel it and you can't come to understand it. But initially, that's what the way is. Yes, why? What are the dynamics that make that happen? Because the Creator made sure that the yesh should not be attached to its source in its conscious state. Not like, unlike that we're going to learn about shortly. So therefore, it's a mitzias ta'atzmei, a yesh. That's what's called a yesh. Now, this doesn't mean the yesh is a bad thing. It's actually, that's exactly what God wanted to create. He wanted tachtenim, or else there's no purpose to the whole existence. The purpose is to be a separate, independent entity. Now,
they attached like this.
Let me just finish the point I want to make. Let me just finish here. So therefore, that's the way we are. And Oyer, on the other hand, is exact opposite, diametric opposite. Its whole existence is to tell us there's a source. Its whole existence is to say, I don't exist on my own. All I am is a reflection of my source, which introduces that type of divine awareness into human awareness. So essentially, the tzimtzum itself is where the split takes place. God conceals divine consciousness, Oyer, through Helam tzimtzum, in order for an independent consciousness to emerge. If Oyer is not concealed, everything is like Lifnei Tzimtzum, Er Memala Kol HaMetzias. All we know about is one consciousness, divine consciousness. There's no room for any other, literally. Okay. Would you like to ask something?
No, but yet you just said that before the Chet they had both, which is an amazing thing. I mean, I mean, I'm not at the level to be able to conceive of it, but just amazing.
Well, the closest approximation to that is children, hevel she'en bei chet, which means a breath that has no sin, children, because they're not in a state of having that independence. That's why children till bar mitzvah, bas mitzvah, they don't have that. There's a certain innocence. Unfortunately, that innocence will be lost, and often it's lost early due to being polluted by people who are a yesh. So though a child is an existent yesh in its presence, but it doesn't really have that type of saying. If a child was educated properly, it could be taught to only have divine consciousness. But it's still, the metzius of a child is a yesh. That's the fact. Existence is yesh. That's what is defined by. It's not ur. Even like he says, like he says in Shari Yochid Vamuna, and like we're learning here, that all of existence is due to the Dvar Hashem that gives it energy, but that's concealed from our consciousness.
So their teacher was the Nachash, and that's what screwed them up. They had the wrong teacher.
It wasn't just the teacher; they also had a Nachash within them, or else it couldn't have influenced them. Okay. Now, I want to go back to the first footnote before I continue. Let me just see. Before he goes to Oyer, I want to talk the first footnote. The Rebbe says the following on the words "V'hainu de'ein zeh ma shayesh eina be'erech ha'atzmus." So the Rebbe says "Ki milsa de pshitahi," the pshitahu, because it's an obvious fact, basically. Milsa pshitahu. In other words, the Rebbe is saying, why is the Frierdiker Rebbe writing that we're not talking about the yesh being ein arech? Its existence is infinitely distant. He's only talking about the way the yesh is created in a distant fashion. So the Rebbe says, because it's a milsa de pshita, that's a simple fact. That's an obvious fact, that a yesh is infinitely distant from its source. We need to analyze this footnote, because the fact of the matter is that earlier in the Maimorim, both in Ayin Beis and in Tzaddik Dalet, he did make that point, that it's also that besides being ein arech, it's also its manner. But I think the Rebbe is saying here, when we say pashut, it's not, it's pashut in the fact, number one, that it's a fact that it's that way. The chiddush is really to say the manner, the way it's created is ein arech, which is what really distinguishes it from oir. Because the first thing that it is ein arech, that doesn't distinguish it from oir, is also ein arech to atzmus, infinitely distant. That's one thing I would say. And the second thing is regarding our theme here, not relevant. Our theme here is not about whether it is ein arech, is whether it feels its source, not whether it is infinitely distant. Oir actually feels its source. Maybe I just repeated what I said in point number one. But that's what the Rebbe says, milsa de pshitahu. And then the Rebbe adds something else. He writes, Ule hakavona, and maybe the intention to write here is the ein zeh rak ma. In a way, the Rebbe is like shifting the position, because it says ein zeh. Why does he say ein zeh? Why is this not? It's saying it's not the fact that the yesh is infinitely distant. It is a fact that the yesh is infinitely distant. So why doesn't the Frierdiker Rebbe say rak? So I think the Rebbe is giving maybe two options. One is because it's an obvious thing, and that's why he doesn't discuss it. But then the Rebbe says, maybe it should have said here the word ein zeh rakma, not should have said, or maybe that's the kavona. When you say the ein zeh, it's not that the yesh is infinitely distant. In other words, the Rebbe is saying it is infinitely distant, but it's an obvious thing. But the kavona really should be saying that it's not only that the yesh is infinitely distant, it's also that its manner of creation is in an infinitely distant way. I think that's what the Rebbe is saying. Actually, that, and then, so the milsa de pshita, the Rebbe is coming to answer, what does it mean, ein zeh? Ein zeh seems to suggest that it is be'erech. So the Rebbe is saying, no, it's definitely shalei be'erech, but he's not saying it here because it's an obvious fact. And now with the rak, it makes it stronger, because it's not only that, it's also this. That's how I understand the footnote.
Could it be also that it's not that really, but they just feel that because of the way of creation? I don't see how that adds anything to the whole thing. I mean, what do you mean? The way of creation is distant? I mean, it doesn't make any sense to me at all. and I don't see any
What
necessity.
are you saying? The Oyer is created in a way that's close. The Oyer feels its source. And the Yesh is created in a way from distance. It doesn't feel its source. It's not attached. That means Ein Arech. It feels like it's its own. It doesn't have any way it indicates on its source. That's called Ein Arech. That's
I'm not speaking about the way of creation, the way
that's the way it's created. It's created in a way that it should not feel its source in any given way.
manner of creation. It's the word way.
I don't know
could
what it's to me.
be, the way could be what he wants.
I'm not even sure what you're asking.
Okay,
It's created as a yesh that does not connect to a previous state.
right. That I understand completely, but
That's called Ein Arech.
the way it's actually
That
built.
is called Ein Arech. 1 second. That is what means Ein Arech. There's no erech. In its manner of creation, it's not created in a progressive, step-by-step way, where you have one state, then it shapes, like say you take a raw piece of clay and you shape it into another state, another state, another state. It's a leap from state of ruchnius to state of gashmius, a leap, an ayin, yesh ma'ayin.
That I understand. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Mashenkin ha'oyer, by contrast, the oyer, hina levadzes, besides the fact shesavuse eina b'derech ein arech, that its manner of emergence or its manner of coming into being is not b'derech ein arech, elegam b'bchinas kiruv. He says gam. Why? Because there is an element of ein arech, because atzmus is infinitely distant, but there's also an element of kiruv, ukanal. Like we learned earlier, the Rebbe cites Perek Chavav Chav Zayin, chapters 26, 27, which is just the last mimer that we learned. I'll give you the pages 117 through 121. So like what did we learn there? The Eina Kiruv Mamish. It's not Kiruv Mamish. It's not very close, literally close. Aval Eina B'chinas Richuk. But it's also not in the state of distance. Why? Because the Eir at the end of the day is a gili. It's attached to its source. Yes, there's an infinite element because the source is not defined by Eir. But the Eir, in the way it's created, is that it's close to its source. It's like when we say about Yeshua, La Yomish Metecha El. Yeshua never left. He was always near Moshe Rabbeinu's tent. He never went away from it. In other words, the being of Eir is to be close to its source. Close doesn't mean physical, it means sensing it, connected to it. It doesn't exist without it. And there's a reason it was created that way, because we want to have something that tells us about the source. So you can't call it kiruv, mamish, but you also can't call it richuk. So this is one thing. Besides this fact, that Eir is different than a yesh. Yesh is not like that. The yesh doesn't have any element of that. The yesh does not sense its source. It's not attached to its source. It doesn't feel. It doesn't have this. It's completely b'derech richuk and ein arech. Not just the manner way it's created. He says levad zeis. Besides that, hari eifon hametzias, the metzias eir hu shemargish es mekere. So he's adding a third element now. So besides the fact, I should rephrase what I said before. Besides the fact that the way it's created is not from distance, but some type of commensurate, because the Eir is Megala, reveals. He says, besides that, the Eir is Margish es Mekere. The Eir feels and senses its source. So in other words, he's breaking this into two. One is that the Eir is created in a way of Gilui, and the second, that it feels its source. Shu behepech inyan hayesh. That is the diametric opposite of the inyan of yesh. The yesh hu she'ena margish es mekere. The yesh's existence is one that does not feel its source. Umitzias se'er margish es mekere. And the existence of light is that it feels and senses its source, to the point we said even before, even more than that it feels that it doesn't exist without the source. Fahainu. So what do we have from this? What this means? The ba'er nirgish boy, in the Eir it's felt. Eich shekol mitziyusei hurak mitzad mekere. So it feels its source, but he's going further. It means that it senses, in this Oir is sensed that its entire existence is only due to its source. And therefore, as a result of that, it's not an existence ba'atzmei within itself, on itself, in its own, doesn't have any mitzias. He doesn't say mitzias le'atzmei, he says be'atzmei, which would suggest that it doesn't sense any sense of self, basically. Okay. So just to break it down a bit, I would say the following. There's not 3 levels, but 3 aspects here. And 2 main differences between the Yesh and the Oir. The thing they have in common is they're both creations of God, and Atzmus is beyond them. What they don't have in common is their identity and their personality and the way they came into being. The Yesh comes into being with a leap, Ein Arech, and because if it was attached to its source, and it felt it, it wouldn't be a Yesh. So 2 things: it's not attached, and it doesn't feel it. With the Oir, 2 things. Number 1, that it's attached, which means like Oir in the sun, the light of the sun, sunlight is always attached to the sun. And the second thing, which means attached, it means it's created in a way that it should be a revealer. And the second thing is that it feels its source. So hypothetically only, it doesn't make sense what I'm going to say now, but hypothetically, just to drive the point home, you could say, what happens if an entity is attached to its source, but it doesn't feel its source? Let's say God created something, it should be attached, shouldn't feel. Does that make any sense even? So I'd probably argue it doesn't make sense, because if it's not attached and it doesn't feel, for all practical purposes, it's not attached. Like the Yesh is also technically attached to the source. Of course, existence couldn't be 1 second existent if there was no source giving it energy. But because it's not created in a way of attachment that we can say, here I am attached, therefore you also don't feel it. So not sensing it and attachment seems to be interdependent. And yet he does distinguish and says, not only is it created in a way of closeness, or not distance, I should say, also it actually feels its source to the point that it feels that it doesn't exist without its source. Just wanted to spell it out, because it seems like he's talking 2 aspects of it, which I would say are interconnected and interdependent, but still it's 2 aspects to the process, the levad zeis. Okay. Now, if anybody has any questions, now's a good time. If not, he's going to now go on to explain the difference between Bittul 1 and Bittul 2, which is a complete addition from the Frierdiker Rebbe, not from Ayin Beis. What we learned till now are scattered lines from Ayin Beis with explanation. So if you compare to Ayin Beis, you'll see several lines are from Ayin Beis, but the Frierdiker Rebbe makes much more connected lines, like this levad zeis we just spoke about is the Frierdiker Rebbe's addition. Okay, if anybody wants to, any questions or comments? If not, let's continue. Okay. So middle of the page. So he's now going to start like this. Now that we've established, and let me just sum it up, that Oir senses its source and senses that it does not exist without its source, and without the source it wouldn't exist. So it doesn't have any independent existence. Yesh is the diametric opposite, meaning it feels itself, does not feel its source, and therefore feels itself as an independent entity. And we're talking initially, we're not talking about through avodah or through contemplation or through hisbonenus, none of that. So therefore, there's this fundamental bittul in Oir, which of course the goal is that we should learn from Oir, and Oir should transfer its bittul to us, or that we have in our Oir HaNeshama such a level of bittul, which we'll talk about later about how it impacts us. But this is the bittul that we're discussing now. Before I continue, I forgot one more thing I wanted to say. I think this was pointed out in earlier classes. There are times he says that the mokr is nirgish ba'ir, and there are times he says that Oir is margish es ha-mokr. I wanted to just pause a moment on that. is there this difference between the two? Because obviously we know Eir is not a conscious creature that feels pain or feels joy or feels its source or doesn't feel its source. This is all far more conceptual. But he does make the distinction between right here in the same two lines. He says, like these words. He says, margish es mekere, and then a line afterwards, and the mitzias esh eina margish. Then he says, the nirgish boy ekshekol mitzias. Is there a difference, or is it just semantics here? Now, obviously, everything is bediuk, because if you say it's nirgish boy, it's not saying the Eir is an active, conscious entity that feels its source. Like a yesh, you could say that till now I didn't feel my source. I worked by myself. I davened and I learned and I did mitzvahs, and now I feel my creator. Yoda kol pol ke'ata pa'alte. I'm aware. I feel. I sense. Eir never didn't sense. So it's not like it was first in a state of unawareness and became Eir. By definition, is a sensory entity that is connected to. So is there a difference between nirgish boy or margish? If anybody wants to weigh in, by all means. I'm not positive. I would like to think there is a difference, but I'm not sure what it is exactly. Is he saying that the Eir does have, if Eir was some form of entity that it's always feeling its source, let's say like a fish is always feeling the water as its source, or is it really, and nirgish means the Eir is just, it's sensed within the Eir, the source all the time. Is there two levels here or not? I'm not positive. And it's fine. We can move on without an exact distinction. I'm just pointing out the language. Okay? Fine. So with that, let's continue then here. Ubezeh yuvan. With this we will understand the depth of the difference and the distinction between Bittul be'efen ha'Beis la Bittul be'efen ha'Aleph behedet tfisas makim. With this, we will understand what we just discussed, the depth of the difference between this second form of Bittul, which was feeling its source and therefore feeling it doesn't exist without the source. So its entire existence is due to the Makkah. And the Bittul of Eifan Aleph, which was about Hedet Tfisas Mokim, no standing, feeling nullified, not feeling any sense of self in the presence of a greater force, of the source in this case. So he's going to now explain the depth of the difference. It doesn't just say hefresh, emek hefresh. So it's like a fundamental or a deep, an essential difference with a depth in it. The ima yes. Because even though the bittul the head that tfisas makom who bittul naila, even though the first bittul, that feeling nullified, and I have no tfisas makom, like no standing, I don't have any value, significance in the light, in the face of the source, even though it's a bittul naila, an interesting word he's using. It's a very exalted and lofty and high level of bittul. It's not a small thing. It's not superficial. Makol mokim, nevertheless, it does not mean that its existence has been nullified, has been sublimated. It doesn't mean that the bittul has permeated. Well, negaya means touched, but negaya means has shifted or permeated or touched or some way impacted is a good word in its actual existence. He's going to explain why. This bittul is only due to the fact that compared to a higher level of Eir, whom is battle, he becomes nullified, he becomes insignificant. But it's not that he himself has fundamentally lost his existence and identity. And he's going to give the example with the flame. Like in the example of the light of the candle, that's nullified in comparison to the sun. Okay, interesting way of putting it. The bittul is only in the light that it gives off. That there's no significance to that light, but not the flame, the candle itself. Its existence as a candle doesn't disappear, doesn't get diminished. Not in the Ner itself. And we discussed it, but it's pretty obvious. The flame doesn't get extinguished. It's still there. The candle is there. It's intact. Take away the sunlight, and it's fully functional and giving off light and actually has a benefit. Its function of giving off light and illuminating has no value because there's now much a greater light. So what's the benefit? Mayahan. What benefit is there? There's no significance to the light. But the existence of the Ner itself, of the flame, the candle itself, does not get weakened or diminished. Shadugman bezeh, and I was going back to the first Eifin HaBittul. If you remember, the flame was an example, the candle, to a small chacham and a larger chacham. The example of this, the chacham cotton, shemizbatel lifnei chacham gadol. A chacham cotton meaning a lesser, wiser person in the presence of a greater, wiser, a wiser person than him. He's only insignificant, nullified, and feels insignificant in the presence of the chacham gadol. But nevertheless, this bittul it doesn't affect his actual existence. He doesn't become ois existent, doesn't become ois mitzias. As a matter of fact, the chacham gadol moves on, or the chacham cotton goes back to his regular location. He could be considered the greatest teacher, and he continues to function and teach and do everything he has to do, exactly like the candle and the sun. It's only due to so-called an external impact. Something external came into play, the sunlight, so the candle is now insignificant. The Chacham Gadol's presence is there. The Chacham Cotton is Bittul. But he himself is not shifted. Nothing has changed. Even though I will say, in volume 1, I want to just point it out. In volume 1, the Maimer of Dvarim, I recall, Ayin Gimel, he does say, just in case you want to look it up, because I was comparing notes. So he says the following. At the bottom of page 567, Sif Reish Pei, chapter 280, he says these words, exactly this. The Chacham Cotton is bizbatel, that the point Eine Tefes Mokim. So he says it's only a bittul in his pashtus. It's only a bittul in his expression, but not the etzem amahus, because he still remains a chacham. He says, nevertheless, there's still a bittul be'etzem amahus, because he actually, in the feeling of the chacham cotton, he feels himself completely bottle. He loses himself entirely in the presence of the greater chacham. But then he goes on and says, not be'etzem amahus, because he continues to be a chacham and he continues to be able to function. But that doesn't mean that it was superficial completely. It means he may carry that bittul even when he goes back to his own domain where he's a chacham gadol. But I don't want to go into that because it's not so relevant. I just wanted to qualify. Like you said, it's a bittul be'efen naila. It's a bittul naila. We're not talking about it. It's not dismissing it. However, it's still not the level, which is now going to explain as the efen habeis. So I'll upon him. Here's what he says here. So, but he continues to still speak about this. Okay, so the gabe chacham gadol, it's ein negeya be'etzem hamitziyah shalei. It doesn't impact the very nature of his existence or the very being of his existence. Va'amashal b'zeh, he's giving an example of this. Kamoi sari hamalucha. An example of this is sari hamalucha. These are the ministers in an empire. Sari hamalucha. So you have the king is the melech. The sarim are his ministers. So they're leaders, but they're not the ultimate leader. So sari hamalucha. Shem yeshvim rishena b'malchus. They sit in the top tier of malchus. In the hierarchy, they're the top obviously under the king, the Sari HaMaluch. They are the, Asher kol inyoni HaMedina nichtochim umisnagim al piyam. All the matters of the kingship of the nation, I should say, the Medina, the country, are determined and governed by them. Nechtochim is an interesting word. It's like it's like cutting a law. When you rule, there's a ruling. So it's sometimes used. Nechtochim comes from the word chaticha, to cut. It means like defining and determining. These are the laws that govern. And the word umisnagim is governing. So everything al piyam literally means by their mouth, by their order, by their command. So they are essentially the leaders that all the matters of the nation or the country are determined and governed based on their order or their command. Ubiyodam, and they have the power, lahomis, ulahachis, to kill or to give life or to grant life. In other words, ulakvoya chukim, and to establish laws, ulases mishpatim, and to run courts of law. Or lases mishpatim means, I don't know, lakvoya chukim. No, I'm sorry. Lakvoya chukim means to designate and establish laws. Ulases mishpatim is probably to, what's in chukim and mishpatim? Mishpatim would mean actually judgments. In other words, you establish laws like writing a constitution, and you establish laws, and then lasis mishpatim is basically the governance on an ongoing basis of that govern this country or this nation. It's interesting, we're learning this right now, right after an election, right? Yeah. Hine, okay, so that establishes the authority and the position of these ministers. So now he says, Hine hasarim ha'elu. These ministers, ba'amdam lefnei hamelech, when they stand before the king, oy moshel hamedina, or the ruler of the country. No, it may not even be a king. It can be a president. It can be a prime minister. Harihem is batlim bebittul kol muhusam. They are mizbat. They're nullified. Bebittul kol muhusam. Their entire personality is in a state of sublimation or subjugation. Behedet tfisas makim klal. Complete lack of standing altogether. Klal. Ba'amdam lefnei hamelech, as they stand before the king. So here they are, the rulers of the country, governing. They can determine someone will live or someone will die, establishing laws. They're the leaders of the country. But when they stand before their king, all that disappears. Not their standing disappears. In front of the king, they are completely insignificant. So that same minister who exerted such power and control in front of the king, it's all nullified. The imzeh, and yet at the same time, bitseisam es pnei hamelech oy hamoshel, when they leave the presence and they're no longer before the king, pnei hamelech, before the face of the king, or the moshel, or the leader, ubavoyim ish mehem al mishmarte, and when each individual returns to his post, in the governance of the matters of the empire, each one of them goes right back and feels the significance and stature of his position exactly as it was kasher hoya. So here they are in this powerful position in front of the king. It all disappears. But then when they go back to their positions, back to their posts, so to speak, and their place, their hergish mitziyus is kasher hoya as it was. Ulapamim, I mean, it's interesting, the elaboration of this mashal. Maybe the Frierdiker Rebbe was trying to be mavarer the ministers of, this is 1933. So it wasn't exactly great times as far as leaders of the countries in Europe. Not sure. It could be he's trying to so-called dissect or maybe rewire the essence of the leaders of the time. I don't know. Anyway, I'm just going on. Ulapamim, and at times, who be yesterday's. They don't just return to their posts and they back to the Metzias as they were. That it's much more intensity. They're far more, I don't want to say the word arrogant. They feel themselves even more important. Li is the Klolosin Habitl, the head of Tfisas Mokim. He doesn't explain why. It could be because since they weren't fired by the king, and since they were the king, they feel even more empowered to fulfill their position and their authority. It doesn't say it explicitly, but I'm wondering why would they be more? Not less, we understand, but why more? Could be that's the reason, because in a sense they now are their mandate was renewed or ratified or endorsed. So Kaponim, so all this is due to the fact, why? Lies, because the Klolos Inyan Habitl, the head of Tfisas Mokim, ain't in the Geya B'Metzias. Because the Bittul of head of Tfisas Mokim, of not having any standing and feeling nullified, insignificant, does not impact B'Metzias in the existence of the one that feels that Bittul. Well, the poem of the close in Bittul, ain't in the Geya B'Metzias. Hakavana b'zeh, says the Frierdiker Rebbe. The intention in this, shemisyaches yesur el bitl hamuhus. Okay. It's interesting. He's saying, so it doesn't affect their mitzias. The intention is that it relates more, this bittul, this first level of bittul of the ministers, relates more to bittul hamuhus. I know it may sound like a deeper bittul, but he means to say it doesn't affect their being, their identity. It more affects their true essential being. In other words, their bittul before the king is not external and superficial, but it doesn't impact who they are. It impacts when they think about their entire real position. At the end of the day, all they are ministers of the king. I think that's what he means here. Because the next line is going to say, Mashenk in the bittul, the second bittul, Mashen and Mitzias last Miklau, says whole Mitzias in the Geya B'Metzias mamish, not just the Mahus. So I know usually we think in terms that if it affects your Mahus, it's deeper than it affects your Mitzias. Because Mahus is your inner being and Mitzias is your outer standing. But here he's basically saying the bittul affects more their inner being because they know the king is the king. It's not like they are looking to mutineer against him, but it doesn't permeate their outer position. They go back to the same place of their authority, and in other words, the bittul to the king does not affect their standing as ministers, and on the contrary, they can be even stronger. So it's a bittul, but it does not impact the entire being. Whereas the bittul be'efan Beis, we're going to stop here, but in the next page is going to continue that impacts the very mitzias of always feels I have no existence of my own. In other words, it would be like the ministers never feeling any standing even when they're not in the presence of the king, so to speak. But we'll learn that inside. The last line is an interesting line. I don't want to elaborate more because I think it's going to be understood when we contrast it to the second Eifan of Bittul. So bottom line, he's explained what Heded Tfisas Mokim with another example that we have not heard before, with the ministers and the king, and essentially that it's an existence that's nullified in the presence of something greater, but it itself, its outer identity is not impacted. And that's why it goes back to where it was, and maybe even sometimes more stronger even. So this is the bottom of page 138. We shall stop here. I just want to say, by the way, the footnote, the second footnote of the Rebbe, I actually wrote that Ayin Beis, with B'Milkere, says, Liya Shemitzi Yusir Dafke Shalei B'Chins Dveikus B'Mokir Harihu. B'mkere, rather. The Rebbe, in Ayin Beis, the language is actually different, and the Rebbe would not make the footnote if he read the Ayin Beis, because I'm theorizing, I can't say for sure. Because the Ayin Beis does make the flow smoother. Just pointing that out. I wanted to just react to that